Hi, this is Jonathan Slater, host of Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. Tête-à-Tête is a production of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, Association d'études juives canadiennes. When I went off to university, my parents moved back to Manhattan from the Bronx, to a neighborhood once called Germantown. At home, I'd check out the intriguing places connected to that earlier era: German variety stores, bookshops, record stores, and marzipan confectioners. There was also this curiosity across the street, a 1930s tenement building with a swastika worked into the brickwork. My dad told me about the German Bund members who would parade up the avenue back in the 30s, the Nazi rallies across the river in New Jersey, and of course, the big one that took place in the old Madison Square Garden. I first heard about Adrien Arcand when I settled in Quebec more than 30 years ago. Arcand had been a self-proclaimed fascist from Montreal, the so-called Canadian Führer, and founder of the National Unity Party. To me, Arcand was like that inlaid swastika in the building across from where my parents lived, an unsurprising curiosity of a bygone era. Though I wonder how many school kids today in Quebec and the rest of Canada, and for that matter their parents, know who Arcand was and what he stood for. I wonder because learning about political extremism and its warning signs matters. That understanding helps us as individuals and the communities we live in to recognize those signs. Like as a Canadian government report notes, growing intolerance, conspiracy-driven rhetoric, and the refusal to accept democratic rules. My guest today on the podcast, in his own words, likes to study old problems with continued relevance for our times. Tyler Wentzell is an historian, legal scholar, lawyer, and military professional whose research includes projects focused on rule of law, foreign fighters, and right-wing extremism. His most recent publication, co-authored by Pierre Anctil and Simon-Pierre Lacasse, is Rethinking Adrien Arcand in Historical Context and appears in English with a French translation by Valentina Gadi in the fall 2025 edition of Canadian Jewish Studies, Études, juives, canadiennes. Tyler, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Tyler, before I ask you to say more about your article, I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room, as many Canadians might not have heard of Adrien Arcand. Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Adrien Arcand is a fascinating and disturbing character in Canadian history. I first learned about Adrien Arcand when I was a kid, and I read Pierre Berton's book about the Great Depression.
And where did you grow up when you were a kid? Where were you?
Nova Scotia.
Nova Scotia, okay.
So I'd never been to Toronto. I'd never been to Montreal. And in that book, he described Adrien Arcand and his somewhat infamous, in some circles, rally at Massey Hall in 1938. And it was one of those attention-grabbing scenes. Scenes of Berlin was how he characterized it, where, paramilitary individuals with Nazi swastikas on their armbands are parading around, banners, the expressions that were used, the use of the Hitler salute, a very striking image. And to go on and learn that sort of thing was occurring in Montreal and Toronto at a time when not my parents but my grandparents were still alive was extraordinary and distressing. So Adrien Arcand was a journalist, and he was somewhat famous in some circles, but he held the ear of the fascist population, of the anti-Semitic population, as one of the more dramatic characters and leaders in those circles.
What was the size of that population? I mean, can you put numbers on how many people, whether it was in Quebec or in Ontario? What was his draw like?
Well, as with a lot of these kinds of movements, what he said and what was real were very different things. He claimed to have had tens of thousands of followers across the country by 1938 when they expanded out of Montreal. But in photographs, when they actually gathered, it was never more than several hundred people. And it's hard to say how many people who may have subscribed to his various newsletters and purchased copies of his pamphlets were actual members. He certainly had influence, but hundreds of members, not the thousands, not the tens of thousands of members that he always claimed that he had.
So you've just been describing the impressive nature of these scenes in Montreal, in Toronto, and that had an effect on you. But what was your motivation for your research on Arcand? What's the origin story behind your collaboration on this article in particular, the one that you worked on with Pierre Anctil and Simon-Pierre Lacasse?
A few years ago, I met Pierre in Montreal. I came to Montreal to present some of my research on the Trotskyist movement in Canada. So Pierre and I, we had just met and we were talking, and as historians do, you get into talking about your research, and we started to talk about Adrien Arcand, and it became very clear once we talked through it a little bit that we were talking about a very different Adrien Arcand, because Pierre is intimately familiar with the French language sources on the subject, with the Yiddish language sources on the subject, and I had been looking mostly at the English language sources on the subject. I'd been looking at how Adrien Arcand was depicted in the Toronto Daily Star, in the Globe and Mail, in the pamphlets that were being produced in the city where I live, in Toronto. And we realized that we had a situation of Canada's two solitudes playing out, where the character of Adrien Arcand in French language media and English language media and Yiddish language media was a very different person. We thought that was a really interesting thing, and we put together a conference panel on the subject.
Well, I'm going to ask you about working with Pierre Anctil and also with Simon-Pierre Lacasse, but I want to continue with this notion of how the media were covering Arcand, because it really fascinates me. And in particular, this article, while it's about Arcand's rise and fall, in many ways, it's a story about the story, as you alluded to. I'm a media scholar primarily, so what I found most interesting in the article were the ways various print media inside and outside Quebec, and also inside and outside of English-speaking Canada, were covering Arcand and his activities. The English language press, particularly as the Toronto Daily Star was the paper, is that correct? Yeah. Seemed to be handling his story differently than, say, the French language papers. Can you say a little bit more about the way Arcand was covered in these two solitudes, as you quite accurately mentioned?
So in Montreal, where Arcand had his roots, he was well known. He was reported on in the Yiddish language press, as Pierre Anctil addresses in his part of the article. But in most of the French language media, in most of those newspapers, he was known, but he was not taken seriously. He was not written about in the major French language newspapers. He he was in the background. He was a character, not taken seriously at all.
And why was that? Why wasn't he taken seriously? Was it something in his character or in the message itself? Why wasn't he sort of propelled into the foreground?
His movement was relatively small, fringe characters. He was sort of a hypocritical and inconsistent, mercurial person. And he had his own forums for presenting his side of the story. So he was an editor, he contributed elsewhere. He was playing up his version of events in those forums, but in the rest of the newspapers seemed to mostly ignore him. Beyond that, that's more something that Pierre can speak to than I can. But by the time Arcand, his party was going through a bit of a unity crisis, and one of the ways he was trying to bolster his position was expanding into the rest of Canada, trying to create a national movement. So he tried to expand into Toronto. He built connections with Toronto. He came and he visited a few times, and he met with fellow travelers in the fascist anti-Semitic world. And he started to get some play in the English language newspapers who had never heard of him. So they had not come to the conclusion that he wasn't to be taken seriously. He seemed to be an up-and-comer. He was described in one editorial as a brilliant young French Canadian, because in the English language press, he was new to them. He was interesting, and they ignored many of the hateful aspects of his platform. and focused largely on the fact that he was bringing together French Canadian Catholics and English Canadian Protestants. Like, he was treated like he was a bridge builder, he was a connector, instead of someone who was deeply anti-Semitic, and everything he stood for was at the expense of Jewish Canadians.
Right. And of course, like many Francophone Quebecers, he was a Catholic, right? But the church, you mentioned the church was somewhat dismissive of him. Am I correct?
Certainly, he was. The church was mostly dismissive of him. They largely ignored him, and yet he was able to make some inroads among French Canadian Catholics. And many of their meetings were rather famously held in church basements.
Thinking of perhaps a little bit later movement, I'm trying to place it in time, but there was the L'Ordre de Jacques Cartier, the famous La Patente, which was the secret society of right-wing Catholics. So I would imagine that a fascist movement wasn't something that was totally unappealing to people in the province, but the evidence seems to point in the other direction.
Well, certainly, but that's one of the difficulties in assessing popularity, assessing membership numbers, because there were lots of different segments of the population in Quebec and in Ontario that would look at aspects of what Arcand was promoting and tacitly agree with parts of it. So, for instance, in Toronto, even though Adrien Arcand was a Catholic, and many of his supporters in Quebec certainly were Catholics, some of his supporters in Ontario were members of the ordinarily fervently anti-Catholic Orange Order. But to some extent, they could set aside their differences in their rather sclerotic view of what Canada could and should be. Now, this caused problems down the road, which is why the organization didn't survive very well, because parts of what became the National Unity Party did take exception to being led by a Catholic. That was not acceptable to them. So it created tensions within the organization.
Fascinating. I had the great pleasure, actually 2 years ago, in 2024, when the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies had its annual conference in Montreal. And the association did what it typically does at these conferences. It holds a day of talks open to the public, Community Day as it's called. And although the conference was being held at McGill, the Community Day was on the campus of Concordia University. And you were on a panel with Pierre Anctil and Simon-Pierre Lacasse talking about Adrien Arcand, if my memory serves me correctly. It was a great talk. So when I saw the article that probably was a result or connected to that talk, I mean, had you been working on the article yet with them when you appeared at the conference in 2024?
No, I certainly had it in my head that it would make for a publication, but I got to give credit to David Kaufman, who's our editor, who saw the potential for the dialogue. Like, the forum, as published in Canadian Jewish Studies, is very different from your standard article. And having seen the panel and read the compilation of it, we were learning as we were going. It was a very interesting iterative process. It was more of a dialogue, more of a conversation, where we realized, oh, this thing that happened after the war in French language media is similar or dissimilar from what was going on in the Yiddish language newspapers about this same guy in the 1930s.
So I have to ask, what was it like working with Pierre Anctil and Simon-Pierre Lacasse? What was it like, the experience with these two scholars?
Oh, it was wonderful. I mean, of the three, I am by far the more junior scholar. So it was really great from a learning point of view to learn about their process and to engage in that kind of dialogue. Both fantastic collaborators and just really nice people to work with.
Jonathan Slater here. I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Tyler Wentzell, a perceptive contributor to the field of Canadian Jewish Studies. Speaking of which, the ACJS will be celebrating 50 years of Canadian Jewish Studies during its annual conference at York University in Toronto, May 31st through June 2nd, 2026. A half-century after its founding, the association remains as committed as ever to investing in the study of Canada's Jewish community, where it came from, where it is now, and where it's going. The ACJS invites anyone with an interest in the Canadian Jewish experience to submit proposals for papers and panels that represent the diversity and interdisciplinarity of contemporary Canadian Jewish scholarship, reflecting both historical depth and current cultural studies, with emphasis on the ways the field of Canadian Jewish studies has contributed, in all its contexts, to Canadian Jewish life and learning. As always, the conference welcomes and encourages submissions in English and French on any topic related to Canada's Jews. The deadline for proposals is January 30th, 2026. For complete submission guidelines and further information, we invite you to navigate to the association's conference page, acjs-aejc.ca/conference. We look forward to seeing you in Toronto. Tyler, after reading your article, and you've spoken a little bit about it, I sort of got the feeling that the Arcand phenomenon was perhaps a bit overblown. Other than the reporting and some of the minimal traction among the public, the media, and as you referenced a few minutes ago, even the church in Quebec seems somewhat dismissive of Arcand. But then I read your Canadian Jewish Studies article from 2023, Scenes from Berlin, Fascism and Anti-Fascism in Toronto during the summer of 1938. And I'm thinking that my initial assessment must be completely off. Arcand was much more than a cosplaying Shamil, I think. He really posed a serious existential threat to Quebec and the rest of Canada. Am I wrong?
I think he did. I think that he did pose a threat, but he was part of a rather complex ecosystem. And I think that's important to remember when we look at whatever modern comparator you would like to use, that he had a broad base of support. A portion of that support bought membership, wore uniforms, marched around. Another portion of that support was much softer and quieter. And the opposition, similarly, was broad and complex, right? There were the people who were outside protesting the rallies, actively resisting, putting up a bit of a physical fight. Then there were people who were advocating for don't rent halls to this certain group. And then there were counter rallies that were held on the street, but also in very large venues across the city of Toronto in response to Arcand's work.
He managed to forge alliances with other fascists, English language fascists in Ontario, right?
Yes, and beyond Ontario too. So when the National Unity Party had its founding rally, they had people from across the country. And this was before the internet. This was before any type of online forum. This was an organization, a relatively broad. It wasn't particularly large, but these people found each other. These people were able to find similar thinking fascists in Nova Scotia in organizations that didn't have newspapers, didn't have a mailbox, and certainly didn't have a web page you could just Google.
This tells me that there was seriously frightening potential to this man and to the people he gathered around him.
Yes, and from what I can tell, looking at the arc of events, certainly there was a broad-based coalition to resist him. But ultimately, what eroded his support had nothing to do with the party or what it was doing. It had more to do with events in Europe, because Arcand had tied his brand to Nazi Germany. He had made the swastika one of his symbols, but he only did that after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. So they had much in common, but he tied himself to that brand. And when public opinion turned in 1938 with events in Czechoslovakia, he was tied to the more broadly construed negative aspects, not just the anti-Semitic aspects of his platform. And a lot of his supporters turned against him.
Did he latch on to any specific figures in Europe, or did they latch on to him? Was there anything substantive going on between Arcand, his party, and what was going on in the incipient Third Reich?
That is a very difficult question to answer succinctly. Certainly, there was correspondence. There was the sharing of cultural material, both in English and in German and in French. Documents were captured. There's all kinds of allegations about what money came from where. very difficult to unpack in any kind of succinct way, but he took as much influence from things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as he did from anything that was purely German. He took a lot from the British Union of Fascists as he did from elsewhere, but there was also a lot of locally grown anti-Semitic fascist material that he adopted for his audience.
So you mentioned the British fascists. There was Oswald Mosley in Britain, George Lincoln Rockwell in the United States. So I don't necessarily want you to quantify, but if we compare Arcand to, for example, a Mosley or a Rockwell, where does he stand in relationship to these other fascist figures in the Western world?
He was a journalist. He was a reasonably good communicator, but he wasn't a deep thinker. He wasn't a deep thinker. So as compared to other fascist leaders who, could write a relatively succinct and understandable manifesto, that wasn't really a skill that Adrien Arcand had. And his Ontario lieutenant, when he came here, was a man named Joseph Farr. He barely wrote anything. I found copies of his speeches, but they're really just long diatribes repeating anti-Semitic and fascist tropes, gigantic claims that, Jews ran all of the country's major businesses, that they were behind the scenes of all the members of parliament, that they were overwhelmingly taking over all the positions in the universities from students to professors. And almost all of it is easily debunked.
Right.
Easily debunked with publicly accessible information, but it didn't stop them from repeating it to their followers over and over again. But it wasn't an ideologically complex position.
Right. And when Arcand was challenged, for example, on things like bank ownership and such, he said yes, but he said something to the effect that the Jews may not own anything overtly. They work behind the scenes and they're influential everywhere, is my recollection of that.
Yes,
correct?
Absolutely. And often when he was challenged on some of the more bizarre conspiracy theories, he would back down because he had no evidence of anything. Like he would make claims that, Leon Trotsky had snuck into the United States disguised as one of Baron von Rothschild's agents.
Well, let's talk about Trotsky, because you talked about the resistance to the fascist movement. I mean, we can't talk pre-war without bringing up the communists. And in Montreal, and I think in Toronto too, there was a vibrant Trotskyist movement. What was that all about?
So the Trotskyist movement is a fascinating one. It's the subject of my next book. The shortest version is that the Canadian Communist Party was as implicated in the schism between Stalin and Trotsky as was anywhere in Europe, as was anywhere in the United States. So we had a small Trotskyist movement that was overtaken by for a brief time, larger splinter off of the Trotskyist movement, which was called the League for the Revolutionary Workers' Party, the LRWP. And the LRWP, again, for a very brief time, was mostly composed of young Jewish working class intellectual types. And that was the main cell, the most visible resistance to Adrien Arcand when he moved into Toronto.
Interesting. When I introduced you at the beginning of the podcast, I alluded to your own words about how you like to link old problems to new iterations of those problems. So here are just some of the stories coming out of the Canadian Jewish news. Winnipeg Public High School, hit by swastikas, responds with anti-Semitism education. NDP leadership candidate sponsors a petition targeting Canadian soldiers in the IDF. Man charged with setting fire to Mississippi synagogue, targeted due to its Jewish ties, FBI says. Israeli-owned New York City Jewish bakery stands accused of participating in Jewish food festival. Now, Robert Brim, who we had on the show last fall, has tallied the alarming rise of Jew hatred in Canada. At the end of last year, 2025, he penned a poignant editorial in the National Post about the NDP gaslighting Canadians on the amplitude of anti-Jewish hate crimes. It would be a sadly rhetorical question, Tyler, to ask whether Jews in Canada should be concerned. But my question for you, rather, is whether the 80-plus-year-old history of Adrien Arcand provides any lessons. Does it hold relevance for what we've been experiencing in Canada these last few years?
I certainly think that it does, and I think that anyone who's interested in such things should read the forum in its entirety, because the three different languages and the different periods provide perhaps different lessons. So Simon-Pierre Lacasse's piece on the post-war resistance to Arcand, I think, is particularly instructive, as is what happened in the 1930s.
Could you talk a little bit about that post-war resistance, even though that was Simon Pierre's section of the forum? Enlighten us a little bit
Well,
about that.
I'll abbreviate it aggressively, and in the hopes that people go and read it. But my main takeaway was the degree to which solidarity with other communities, particularly the Montreal Catholic community after the war, had with Jewish Canadians had changed from what they had in the 1930s to what they had afterwards. And that solidarity, the role of the Catholic Church in confronting, in obstructing Adrien Arcand's efforts to revive his influence, was absolutely fundamental to his inability to gain traction in post-war Canada. So I think the importance of solidarity with all Canadians to stand against hate crimes, hate speech, wherever it goes, because of course any community will resist hate crimes, hate speech against itself, but we need to stand against that together, all different communities, because an act of hatred against one community is an act of hatred against all. That's one part of it. And the other piece is the truth-telling exercise. These conspiracy theories are easy to ignore, and to some extent they should be ignored. However, challenging them in a fair, reasonable, and balanced way, which is no small task. That balance is a difficult thing to achieve because you don't want to validate the conspiracy theories. But David Martin, he wrote a piece in The Nation in February 1938, where he wrote at length, based on an interview he did with Adrien Arcand, where he pointed out these contradictions and these conspiracy theories. And he told that story. And it is a very powerful piece because, incredibly, the journalists who were writing about Arcand before that were not fulfilling that function. They were not challenging these crazy allegations that were being made, these crazy claims. And in not doing that, you can argue that they were just reporting the story as they saw it, but they were also just facilitating his increasing influence. David Martin, by the way, wasn't his real name. His real name was Israel Levine. He was a member of the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party that I was mentioning earlier. And I don't think Adrien Arcand had any idea that he was being interviewed by a Jewish man when he agreed to the interview and spoke so openly about it.
Wow. Well, you did talk earlier in our conversation, Tyler, about the fact that at the time that Arcand was building his network in various places in Quebec and Canada, it was a time without any social media. This was all being done through word of mouth and other traditional means, circulation of newsletters you had talked about and other practices. And of course, today, when we start talking about extremism and the circulation of conspiracy theories, social media has a large part in the amplification of that type of rhetoric. What's your perspective on that if we compare the two eras, separated by over 80 years of distance?
I think one important aspect that we need to acknowledge is that these phenomena can occur in the absence of social media. Social media amplifies, social media accelerates, but communities, good, bad, and otherwise, they can coalesce, they can find each other in the absence of those technologies. So I think that's one thing, is just to acknowledge that, but to acknowledge that a lot of this connection still needs real people and real places where they can interact. One of the things I found so interesting about the developments of the National Unity Party as Arcand's movement tried to expand into Ontario is they were supposed to have this large rally, this private meeting was supposed to take place in Kingston, Ontario. In Kingston, Ontario, they were not able to actually rent a hall. They just couldn't, no one wanted to rent it to them. So they lied about it. They actually had that meeting in Toronto, drove to Kingston told everyone that they had the meeting in Kingston, and then drove back.
Really? Wow.
So these online forums and social media, they let us do these things, but ultimately people need to get together. They need space. They need to have those interactions, and balancing free speech with not affording spaces for heinous organizations is a tough balancing act, but it's an example where they needed space. They were denied that space, so they lied about it.
Wow. Tyler, this has been a fascinating, for me personally, intellectually, a fascinating exploration into Arcand, into a time in Quebec and Canadian history that really needs to be written about and talked about a bit more. So thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Jonathan Slater, and you've been listening to Tête-à-Tête. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to our amazing guest, Tyler Wentzell. This show is produced and edited by Theodora Draper in Toronto. Our music is provided by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are Joshua Tapper and David Kaufman. Tête-à-Tête is a podcast of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. You can find out more about the ACJS and link to our journal and past podcast episodes by checking out our website, acjs-aejc.ca. With plans to be new and improved coming up soon this year, stay tuned for additional information. We're grateful to our supporters, the Taubin family, the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council's Aid to Scholarly Journals program, and the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry. In the show notes, you can find a transcript of my conversation with Tyler Wentzell and a link to our journal, Canadian Jewish Studies, Études juives canadiennes, where you can read Tyler's Rethinking Adrien Arcand in Historical Context and order a print copy of the fall 2025 issue, as well as read his 2023 article, Scenes from Berlin, Fascism and Anti-Fascism in Toronto during the summer of 1938. We'd love it if you could share, like, and rate our podcast. You're also invited to add your email to the ACJS's occasional newsletter or support the ACJS's amazing work by following links in the show notes. If you have comments or thoughts about this podcast episode or any other of our episodes, feel free to email us at acjs@yorku.ca. Come back and join us for another conversation.